The last time BMW made an 8 Series, it was the 1990s. You could get an absolutely glorious V12 under the hood. I thought the 8 Series looked fantastic, although I'm terribly disappointed that I never got to drive one. Fast forward a decent number of years, we have the all-new 8 Series, but this is a very different kind of coupe. This particular model is the M8 Gran Coupe, so coupe plus an extra 2 doors. With BMW's nomenclature, you could definitely be forgiven for thinking that the 8 Series was a 7 Series coupe, sort of like the Mercedes-Benz S-Class 2-door competitor in the BMW lineup. But this is actually targeted at a very different vehicle. This is targeted at the Mercedes-Benz CLS, the Porsche Panamera, and of course, the Audi A7. The model we're taking a look at today is the ultimate version of the A Series. This is the M8 Gran Coupe. For 2021, the M8 Convertible and the M8 2-door coupe are taking at least a year off. We don't know whether they're going to come back to the US for 2022, but 2020 sales didn't go exactly as BMW has planned, so for 2021, the M8 is only going to come in this 4-door format. The 8 Series is the close relative of the BMW 5 Series, so logically the M8 is the close relative of the BMW M5, and they share a lot of M technology under the hood and in terms of suspension design. Be sure and let me know what you think about the look down there in the comment section below. We have BMW's LED laser headlamps. They look very distinctive right there. A lot of cooling going on down at the bottom of the bumper, and pretty well integrated parking sensors as well. The grille may be a bit more demure than the 4 Series or the X7, but there's certainly a lot of cooling going on. We don't have any active grille shutters or anything like that going on here. You can see that the grille slats themselves are very narrow, and then we have a lot of enormous grille openings down there at the bottom. BMW calls their 8 Series 4-door a Gran Coupe. This is very similar to what we see in the Mercedes-Benz CLS, with them calling that a 4-door coupe. Basically what's going on here to make it a coupe, I guess you'd say, is that we have windows without frames, so there's no metal frame that goes around the window like we'd find in a 5 Series or a 7 Series. And then we get a roof line that plunges towards the rear right after the front doors. That cuts back on rear passenger headroom for sure, but it does give this a swoopier, sexier profile than the 5 Series. The M8 gets staggered tires, 275 with 20-inch tires up front and 285 with tires out back. This particular model has Pilot Sport 4S tires on it. Depending on how you want to look at it, the 8 Series either is or is not a replacement to the 6 Series. BMW says this is targeting a different shopper, one with a little bit more cash, because this is more expensive than the models that it replaced. The M8 starts at $130,000 if you want the 4-door version. The 2-door version and the convertible version for 2020 are actually a little bit more expensive than this, but they're not going to exist for 2021. Any way you slice it, this is going to be more expensive than a comparably equipped BMW 5 Series. But they've also styled this differently than the rest of their sports car lineup, like the BMW M4. This certainly has a more restrained and elegant look to it. We still have huge exhaust tips down at the bottom and diffusers going on there, but we have a pretty simple and elegant spoiler right there on top of the trunk lid, and then very elegant restrained tail lamps. As you'd expect out of a modern BMW, there's a 3-liter inline-6 turbocharged engine available under the hood. That's the base engine in the 8 Series. It gives you 335 horsepower and 368 pound-feet of torque. That's the only engine that's going to give you rear-wheel drive. All-wheel drive is available, but it's an option. And if you choose the rear-wheel drive model, it's going to be the most efficient at 24 miles per gallon combined. From that point, we go into BMW's M Performance line. Lately, BMW has been slicing their M pie a little bit finer than before. So we have the M850i, and then we have the full-on M8, which is what we're driving here. And if you want to take things up to the next level of crazy, you can get the competition pack version of the M8. All 3 of these models use a 4.4-liter twin-turbocharged V8 engine. The M850i gives us 525 horsepower and 553 pound-feet of torque. The M8 right here bumps it up to 600 horsepower, and the competition bumps it up to 617. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give these seats 9 out of 10 points. We have a seat that is very similar in design to the BMW M5, but the seating position is a little bit lower and therefore I think a little bit less comfortable than what we find in the M5. We have a manual extending thigh cushion, inflatable side bolsters, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, and a powered tilt telescopic steering column. All of that is memory linked to the 2-position memory over there on the door. I found front seat comfort to be a little bit higher in the Mercedes-Benz CLS and also a little bit higher in the Porsche Panamera, although remember, the Panamera is going to be a great deal more expensive than this if you want the same level of performance. Bearing in mind that BMW is targeting a different shopper with the 5 Series and the 7 Series sedans, I do find those sedans a little bit more comfortable up front, but again, mainly due to the driving position, because the seat is a little bit closer to the ground, meaning that my legs are stretched out a little bit more in front of me, and the more upright seating position that we find in BMW sedans, I find a little bit more comfortable for long distance travel. Hopping into the back seat, we find a little bit more legroom than we find in the BMW 5 Series. That's thanks to the stretch that the platform received. You'll notice that if I sit right here behind myself, I have about 7 or 8 inches left. But I don't have quite as much headroom as we see in BMW's larger sedans. So if I try and put my head all the way back there towards that headrest, my head is touching the ceiling. There's a little bit more room back here than we find in the Mercedes-Benz CLS, and I find the seating position a little bit higher off the ground and therefore a little bit more comfortable as an adult. An interesting touch you'll notice right here on your screen is that this ambient light strip, which is what you're seeing right here on the door, if the door is open, it turns into a blinking red light so that way traffic behind you notices that the door is open. If the door was closed, it would be glowing sort of a purple glow right now. Scooting all the way over to the right side, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person sitting up front very comfortably. I still have about 3 inches of legroom left. So you can see that this is a pretty spacious cabin with the exception of that headroom figure. One thing that I wasn't expecting back here is this 5th seat belt, because we have this absolutely enormous center console. It sticks up a little bit higher than the center seat position, and it's pretty large, meaning if you wanted to sit here in the middle, you'd have to straddle it. It's sort of like riding a hobby horse, I guess. Or perhaps one of those springy horses you see for kids at the park. Now, this is definitely handier than not having a 5th seat belt because you could put a child seat right here in the middle. Obviously, you'd want to put something over this center console right here so that way Cheerios don't end up there in the air vents. But honestly, I'd rather have the 5th seat belt than not have the 5th seat belt. We have a 4-zone climate control system right here, so you can see the 2 zones for the outboard seats, a small storage area right there, 2 USB charge-only ports, and then we have those air vents with some carbon fiber trim. A practical touch back here is the 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. That makes it a lot easier to carry larger, bulkier items in the vehicle while still carrying 4 passengers. So you can put your skis or your snowboard or just random people right here from the cargo area into the passenger area. At 11 cubic feet, this cargo area is about the same size as the Mercedes-Benz CLS, but notably smaller than a 5 Series, a 7 Series, or of course a Panamera or an Audi A7. In our 24-inch roller bag test, I was able to squeeze 3 bags back here in the trunk. I suspect that if the trunk was a little bit squarer, I might be able to get 4. We'll still have 11 cubic feet, but the shape of this trunk means that a 4th one simply wouldn't fit. There's no spare tire under the cargo area load floor because there's nothing under the cargo area load floor. When it comes to the exclusive trunk comfort index, this vehicle loses points for not having a spare tire under the load floor, but it gains points for having releases for the rear seat backs right back here in the trunk, and of course, having a powered trunk lid. Taking a quick look around the inside, you'll notice that some parts are borrowed from other BMW models, but there also are a lot of unique parts to the 8 Series. Since we're in the M8, we have a carbon fiber roof with no moonroof right there, but we do have a suede headliner. This isn't real suede, of course. This is an imitation suede because real suede wouldn't last very long in the heat. We have fixed height shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and powered 2-way adjustable headrests with that M8 logo in there. As you'd expect in a performance vehicle, the bolstering is pretty aggressive on the front seat backs. An interesting touch is that the very back of the seats is made out of a hard plastic right there rather than just giving us a leather wrap all the way around. The seats are perforated because these seats are both ventilated and heated, and you can see that we have some charcoal colored leather accents right there on each side. We also have pretty aggressive bolsters on the seat bottom cushion, and you can see that manual extending thigh cushion up front. The leather inserts on the doors has the same sort of stitching pattern that we found on the seats. This model has the optional Bowers & Wilkins sound system, so we do have metal speaker grates for the mid-level speaker right there, and then the tweeter a little bit higher on the door. The rest of the trim on the door is an imitation metal trim. You can see that we do have a 2-position seat memory over there for the passenger, and a lot of stitched goods going on the top of the door around that pretty distinctive handle hold right there for the passenger door. At the bottom of the door, we find more stitched goods, and on the inside of that bottle holder, we have a felt lining, which helps keep things from rattling around. As you'd expect, build quality and parts quality is very high for a car that starts at $130,000. Moving over to the dashboard, we find more stitched leather, and then we find the BMW iDrive infotainment system right here in the middle of the dash. You'll notice that BMW didn't simply give us a coupified version of the 5 Series styling. This has a slightly different feel to it. The iDrive system is basically the same as the one that we find in the rest of the BMW lineup. It supports wireless Apple CarPlay, and as we see in a lot of luxury infotainment systems, it gives us a touchscreen interface as well as a control knob in the center console, and there also are finger gestures available if you'd rather use those, but it doesn't seem like that's a terribly popular way of interacting with the infotainment system. Below that, we have 2 large air vents. There's also an additional air vent above the infotainment screen if you want air to be a little bit more diffuse. We have the controls for the heated and ventilated seats, the front 2 climate control zones for the 4-zone climate control system, some physical buttons for the infotainment system right there, and then a storage cubby that's covered by carbon fiber trim right there. This is where we find a wireless Qi charging mat for your smartphone. I can barely fit my large smartphone in there. and then we have two decently sized cup holders. They're just barely far enough away from this lid and from these controls that you can put larger American-style takeout drinks in there. Between the front seats, we have a ton of different controls. Let's go through these one at a time. We have a slightly different shifter than we find in most BMW models. If we put it in reverse, it actually stays up there. Drive is over to the right side, but it returns to center. We toggle once more for the sport mode, and then you can toggle up and down for the manual shift mode. You put it in park by pressing that P button right there, and then this toggle controls basically the aggressiveness of the transmission, I guess you'd say. So if we're in drive there, we can toggle this through those three different levels. That controls the shift speed, how harsh the shifts are. If you want really firm, really quick shifts, etc., you want to toggle that all the way up to mode 3. To the left side of that, we find a traction control button, the button for the 360-degree camera system, parking sensors, auto start stop enable disable. This does have auto start stop even though we are the sport model. The engine start stop button there. We have an M mode button over here. The setup button takes us to the M mode configuration in the iDrive system. There are a ton of different things that are configurable with this vehicle. So, for instance, we can choose between Efficient, Sport, and Sport Plus for the engine, chassis, steering, brake, etc. An interesting feature with this all-wheel drive system is that we have 3 different modes. If we turn the traction control to the M mode, right here, M dynamic mode, you notice we now have 4-wheel drive Sport. That's going to send more power to the rear. And then if I were to press and hold the button and turn things completely off, we can actually put the vehicle into 2-wheel drive mode. So you can see now we have that option to engage the 2-wheel drive mode that completely disconnects the front axle. Behind the setup button, we have the button for the active exhaust system, auto brake hold, electric parking brake, and then we have the control for the BMW iDrive infotainment system. Between the front seats, we find a padded center armrest. It's a bifolding style. It opens to reveal a fairly small storage compartment. On the driver's side, we have a configurable full LCD instrument cluster. This vehicle has a driver attention monitoring system that's monitoring your face. You can see we have an IR camera and then IR transmitters right there on either side, so those aren't demon eyes blinking at us. That's part of the driver monitoring system. This display is not quite as configurable as the one that we find in a lot of modern Mercedes models, but it still gives us a decent amount of information, turn-by-turn navigation directions, a moving map display right there in the middle. And versus the average BMW instrument cluster, this is a little bit more configurable because of the M mode button. Speaking of M modes, you'll notice on the steering wheel we have 2 buttons that we don't find in the average BMW, M1 and M2. This gives us quick access to shortcuts in the system to enable and disable certain settings. M1 and M2 are user programmable, but you can see some of the shortcuts that we have available to us. For instance, that one takes us to Sport Plus modes, and then M2 is a little bit less aggressive. And then if I click them again, it turns them off and back to the settings that it was before. The rest of the steering wheel should be pretty familiar if you've driven a modern BMW before. We have shift paddles on the back of the steering wheel, up on the right, down on the left. Pretty aggressive sport grips up top. The controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system over here on the left side, and then the controls for the infotainment system over here on the right. Clearly the M8 is all about performance, so we should talk about those numbers first. 0 to 60 happened in our testing in 3 seconds even. That's 1/10 of a second faster than BMW's claim time for this model. And of course, if you get the competition version, I have no doubt it's going to be just a little bit below 3 seconds. But that's not the most surprising number for this vehicle. Even though this car weighs over 4,600 pounds, I think the braking distance is perhaps more surprising at 98 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is an incredibly short stopping distance, especially considering that this vehicle doesn't have bat crap crazy wide tires. So it's not like this has 315 with tires all the way around. We have 275s up front, 285s in the rear. Those are certainly wide, but they're definitely not the widest tires that are available. The next thing you'll notice about the M8 is just how well this vehicle defies physics. Again, over 4,600 pounds, significantly heavier than many supercars out there, but this will go 0 to 60 faster than a decent number of them, and the 0 to 30 time is amazingly impressive. That's all thanks to the all-wheel drive system that we have in the M8. This is basically borrowed out of the M5, very similar to what we find in the X5M and X6M, and you need all-wheel drive to get this kind of 0 to 30 and 0 to 60 performance. That's one of the reasons that if you have a supercar like a McLaren with 700 horsepower under the hood, it's not necessarily going to get you to that stoplight or that freeway entrance any faster than this model right here because of traction. You need traction in order to be able to apply all that power. That's another reason that, for instance, some of those Dodge vehicles that have absolutely bonkers power figures under the hood, they're not really going to be faster in those 0 to 30 jumps because they can't apply all that power. But as you'd expect out of an M car, this is more than just a one-trick pony. In addition to absolutely incredible acceleration, we have excellent handling, and handling that definitely has a strong rear power bias to it. I like the way the M8 feels out on the road, even though we get a little bit more weight up front than I was expecting. 55% of the weight is on the front axle, 45% approximately is on the rear axle. That's just thanks to the bigger turbocharged V8 that we find under the hood. Now that said, this does not have an overtly front-heavy weight bias like we find in a lot of modern Audis, because the engine is decently behind the front axle. Depending on how you want to look at it, you could see the M8 Gran Coupe as the flagship BMW in America. So not only does this need to be fast, does it need to handle well, but it also needs to feel like a luxury car out on the road. And it's important to remember that unlike perhaps a BMW M3, this has much more of a grand touring style ride. So with the suspension in its comfort mode, I can still feel some of those smaller imperfections out on the road. This is not going to be the most comfortable highway cruiser out there, but it's certainly going to be more daily driver livable than something like an Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio. That's going to be an awful lot firmer. One of the things that I've always appreciated about BMW's more expensive M products, whether we're talking about the X5M, X6M, M5, or now the M8, is that this is a thoroughly livable, absolutely bonkers performance vehicle. So insane 0 to 60 times, absolutely insane grip levels, yet when we get it out on a rougher road like we're on here, it's not knocking my teeth out of my head. Now certainly this suspension is firmer than the average run-of-the-mill 5 Series or other mid-size luxury sedan, but thanks to the adaptive suspension system, this can still give you a very livable ride when you want it. Now I can put the suspension into Sport Plus where it's going to firm things up for sure, but the M8 is still going to feel bigger and heavier than something like an M3. As you'd expect out of a performance vehicle, you can certainly hear the engine when you want to. For instance, when downshifting, we get those perfect rev-matched downshifts, and there's definitely a distinctive growl coming from the back of the M8. At idle, there's definitely a deep burble as well, but the exhaust note is not too loud. I think it's just about right for the mission of a luxury car. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we got 71 decibels in here, which is a little bit louder than some of the other BMWs that you might want to be cross-shopping with this, but it's certainly in keeping with its luxury mission as well. When it comes to fuel economy, the EPA rating is not terribly high for this particular model. We've been averaging about 19 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, so I'm going to go ahead and give this a C when it comes to fuel economy. Of course, if you're interested in fuel economy, you're probably not looking at an M8. Now that said, you will be getting better fuel economy in the 8 Series with the 3-liter turbo, or of course, the base 4.4-liter V8 in the M50i. To be perfectly honest, the V8 versions of BMW's M Performance line are the most intriguing for me, because you can get awfully close to the performance that we find in this model for a whole lot less cash. Now, the M Performance version of the 8 Series, the M850i, is not going to feel quite as special as the M8. We're not going to get the carbon fiber roof that you can see on that one camera view. You're not going to get the M Sport steering wheel with the M paddles right here, M1 and M2. Not all of the M things come along with that M50i, but you are going to get a slightly more civilized ride. The suspension tune is a little bit more livable. You can certainly still corner carve with that M50i, but it's not going to have the same kind of aggressive grip that we find in the M8. But of course, the big thing about the M50i is going to be its price tag. It is going to be a lot less than the model that we're driving here. For 2020, the 840i Gran Coupe will start at $85,000 even, of course before tax, title, license, and destination. Oddly enough, adding the 2 doors to your 8 Series actually reduces its cost versus the 2-door coupe by about $3,000. That could be one of the reasons that the 8 Series Gran Coupe appears to be outselling the 2-door and the convertible versions of the 8 Series, and that's why for 2021, the M8 Coupe and convertible seem to be taking a year off, but the M8 Gran Coupe will still be around. In terms of comparisons, that puts the 8 Series about $1,800 less than a BMW 740i, but a whopping $25,510 more than a BMW 540i. Ouch. And if you want the M8 Gran Coupe that we were driving this week, hold on to your hats because that started at $130,000, and as equipped, it was $152,300. That is significantly more expensive than a number of its key competition from Europe. Let's dive there now. The first up, obviously, has to be the Audi A7. If you want a regular A7, it starts significantly less expensive than the BMW 8 at $69,000. The A7 might not quite have the weight balance that we find in the BMW 8 Series. It has a near perfect weight balance, and we find more of a front-heavy setup going on in the Audi A7, but for the price difference, I'll take the slight disadvantage that that gives the Audi. Audi has really done a great job over the years compensating for the inherent weight imbalance that we find in the Quattro system in their longitudinal engined vehicles, the A4, A5, A6, A7, and A8. It's still there, but it's just not as obvious as it was in the past. You will still notice it if you're really starting to push your A7 or your RS7 harder in the corners. But speaking about that RS7, it's going to be significantly less expensive at $114,000 versus $130,000 starting for the M8. If my own money were on the line, I suspect I might get the RS7 over the M8. It comes across as a little bit less polished, but also having a little bit more personality. I also really appreciate the cargo practicality that we find in the A7. The cargo area is very large, even though it looks a little bit more like a traditional sedan. Speaking of vehicles that are truly sedans, not coupes, next up we have the Mercedes-Benz CLS, which arguably started this whole four-door coupe thing. It's $69,950 starting, which is significantly less expensive than the 8 Series. That's because Mercedes has decided to position the CLS a little bit differently than BMW has with the 8 Series. That's also why we do not have a CLS 63 AMG for 2020, and apparently according to Mercedes, we won't really be getting one in the CLS lineup. Instead, if you're looking for that kind of style, but you want AMG level performance, you're going to want to get the AMG GT 4-door, which is not oddly enough related to the AMG GT. The AMG GT 4-door is really an E-Class or a CLS that has been AMG-ified and turned into a higher performance sedan. But it doesn't have that same engine and transmission arrangement that we find in the GT, and really there's no GT DNA shared other than the name. Although I guess you could say the price tag is shared because it is significantly more expensive than the CLS. $99,950 gets you the 53 model, $140,250 gets you the 63, and if you want the 63S, that'll set you back at least $161,200. Now, if you're interested in the AMG GT 4-door, I do have a quick video on that model on my channel. Rummage around down there in your feed, I'm sure you'll be able to find that video. Now, in my head, if I were looking to spend $150,000 or $160,000 on my next absolutely insane, not quite a coupe 4-door thing, I would probably buy the AMG. It looks a little bit more unique. It's certainly more exclusive with the kind of pricing that we find on the AMG, and it is absolutely insanely powerful and fun. $161,000 for that 63S is definitely a bump above the M8 that we were driving this week, but if you're shelling out over 6 figures for your next car, I don't imagine that that's a huge consideration. The big difference between these two vehicles is that the AMG GT certainly drives and feels like a bigger vehicle. It kind of reminds me more of the Mercedes-Benz S-Class than the E63. It has that sort of feel on it, whereas the BMW M8 really feels very much like the BMW M5. And that is where the next tricky competitor comes in, the BMW M5. And to be perfectly honest, this is going to be real short because I would just buy the M5 over the M8. You have a slightly more practical cargo area, in my opinion. You have a slightly more practical rear seat. You do have an interior that doesn't feel quite as premium as the M8, but the difference is not enormous. The price tag, however, that's definitely going to be a bigger delta. $27,000 is the magic number that separates the M5 from the M8. And performance-wise, the M5 in some ways is a little bit better. It's actually a little bit lighter than the BMW M8. I suspect that if any outlet got their hands on both of these vehicles at exactly the same time, the M5 would probably be just a hair faster than the M8. Next up, we have the Porsche Panamera, because I frequently get asked, why aren't you including the Porsche in your comparison section? Well, the answer, generally speaking, for a lot of the vehicles that we're talking about is that sure, there is a Porsche option out there, but it is a lot more expensive. Now, in this case, however, that's not the case, because the Panamera, although it is wickedly expensive, doesn't really seem that much more expensive than an M8 that was $152,000. For 2021, the Panamera got a refresh, and Porsche has not said how much it's going to cost yet. But for 2020, it started at $87,200. Surprisingly, a little bit less than an 840i. If you want to approach the level of performance that you find in the M8 Gran Coupe, then you're going to be talking about $150,000 for your Panamera, and it goes up from there. If you want to get the turbo hybrid versions, then you can get your Panamera well up over $200,000. And again, that's for 2020, not for 2021. Now, for 2021, it appears that we're going to be getting a little bit more power, better performance figures that bring it a little bit more in line with the BMW M8, because at the moment, according to the manufacturer's numbers, the Panamera is going to be a little bit slower than the M8. Whether we're talking about the 2020 or the 2021, I have to admit the Panamera is a pretty tricky competitor to the BMW, because for this price, I would probably get the Panamera as well. I like the interior of the Panamera. The interior is gorgeously done in that Porsche. Now, the one thing to keep in mind on the Panamera is that options get pretty darn expensive. It's very easy to get carried away with options, and it's very easy to get your Panamera out of the category that's admittedly already expensive for the M8 into an entirely different category of expense. Bottom lining the M8 I think is pretty easy for me, and honestly, bottom lining the 8 Series Gran Coupe is easy for me. If I wanted the extra room, I would buy the BMW 7 Series, and if I wanted the performance, I'd buy the BMW 5 Series. I really, really love the way the M8 is styled, both inside and outside, but is it $27,000 nicer than a BMW M5? I just don't think so. I personally would just get the BMW M5. I think it's more practical as well. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. Now, if BMW gave the M8 650 horsepower, then it would be an entirely different ballgame. The problem in my head is the M5 gives you the same performance for $27,000 less. If it got you better performance for $27,000 more, then that would make sense in my head. But as it is, I would just buy the BMW M5. Let me know down there. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, over at Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.